So the history of slavery in Brazil. Okay, so Brazil received about 4 million slaves, which was over 4 times as many as other American destinations. And over 40% of slaves were transferred to Brazil during the transatlantic slave trade. A large amount of the slaves came from Angola. The slaves were used for household tasks, emptying sewage, and other similar tasks. So the slaves and slave owners worked as a reciprocity. I don't know if that's how you say that. But it was where, as long as the slaves were good to the slave owners, then the slave owners were good to the slaves, and vice versa. Why did Brazil need slaves? They used the slaves for sugar plantations. The land in Brazil offered huge opportunities for sugar market and, like I said, sugar plantations, and which led Brazil to become the world's leading sugar producers. And the abolition of slavery in Brazil didn't come until 1888. And then the treatment of slaves depended largely on the slave owner. So some of the slaves were treated cruelly, given no food, and suffered from horrible punishments, such as being chained to a cart and whipped.
Document 1. The treatment of enslaved Africans and their autonomy in colonial Brazil. After reading both paragraphs, does it appear that slaves are helpless individuals? From the paragraphs provided, the slaves aren't necessarily helpless. They are treated as if they can't breathe without asking their master first. If they were to meet at night, their owners first thought that this was their plan to escape. Explain the connection that the author makes between the present state of Brazil and the federal times in Europe. The present state of Brazil was compared to Europe in the second paragraph. Not only were the Europeans feared more by their slaves, but also carried authority over lower-class Europeans, while the Brazilians did not. Document number 2. The treatment of enslaved Africans and their autonomy in colonial Brazil. Describe common punishments in Brazil. Brazilian slave owners had a crucial way of punishing their workers. They would chain them to the cart and give them hundreds of lashes with a whip. To prevent infections, they would put salt and pepper into the wounds. Oftentimes, they would expose a slave for a whole night tied to a stake over an ant's nest, or on a cross to the stinging of mosquitoes. Why would a slave owner not want his slave to be exposed to religion? If a slave was exposed to religion, the slave owner feared they would revolt against them.
So the Brazilian culture was largely shaped by the Africans that came to Brazil during the slave trade. The slave trade led to a mixing of cultures and ethnicities in Brazil, and that's because the African culture was not wiped out when the slaves were brought, so their culture had a huge impact on Brazilian culture. For example, food, music, dance, and religious practices. Candomblé, which is a religion, is an excellent example of how African culture impacted and shaped Brazilian culture, because the religion is one that was invented in Brazil, but it was actually based on the gods that the slaves brought with them when they came. The slave trade also led to a largely mixed race population in Brazil, which resulted in brown faces everywhere. And race is not an obstacle in modern Brazil, and that can be thanks to the transatlantic slave trade, when the slaves were brought from Africa to Brazil.